Hello and welcome to Just Energy TV. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning in. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but did the same euphemism exist in antiquity? Did their texts and scripts have more than just a phonetic meaning, or was their intrinsic meaning implied by the symbols they used? Laird Scranton is an independent researcher of ancient cosmology and language. He studied in comparative cosmology, where he helped serve synchronize aspects of ancient African, Egyptian, Vedic, Chinese, and Polynesian and other world cosmologies, and have led to an alternative approach to reading Egyptian hieroglyphic words. He has a degree in English from Vassar College. He became interested in Dogon mythology and symbolism in the early 90s. He studied ancient myth, language, and cosmology since 1997 and has been a lecturer at Colgate University and has appeared in John Anthony West's Magical Egypt DVD series. He's been on Ancient Aliens and is the author of the book, The Cosmological Origins of Myth, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, and the Science of the Dogon. His most recent book is Point of Origin. I'm sure he has a new book on the back burner that's waiting to come out, but please welcome Laird Scranton. Hey Laird, how's it going?
Hey Rita, thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm just so excited to have you on with this new video format because we get to hang out, and I don't know, it always makes me feel like we're just sitting at the kitchen table having, an in-depth conversation.
Yeah, it feels more like a cozy visit than just a chat over the phone.
Yeah, exactly. Where I wanted to start, when I think of written languages, because that's one of your things is written languages, I think of hieroglyphics. And in that tradition, the words are made up of a number of symbols. When we look at those symbols, are they characters, like we think of like A, B, C, that really doesn't have any kind of meaning? Or are they symbolic in nature?
Well, that's one of the questions that I had to try to sort out. The traditional viewpoint of Egyptologists is that they're basically phonetic characters like letters are. They're there to convey a sound. But if you think about it, there are roughly 40 phonetic values that most written languages have to represent. And there are over 4,000 Egyptian glyphs. So the chances that they were supposed to be primarily phonetic doesn't make sense. Why would you need that many glyphs to represent the same sound? So one way to sort of get a toehold into it is to realize is to look at the system the way it was before there was writing. That it's understood that ancient creation traditions existed before written language. And so each of these phonetic values that convey meaning in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language had inherent meaning prior to written language. And you can sort of see that transfer. There are about 30 Egyptian glyphs that carry the same meanings as the phonetic values in the pre-written cosmology.
Could you explain, what do you mean by that?
Okay, well, the Dogon, the African tribe that I study from Mali, this is a modern day tribe, they describe how creation happens. They talk about how matter forms. And with every description, or with most descriptions, they also have a drawing that goes with the description. The priests are sort of like, I know the way I am when I try to talk about things is, if I want to explain something, I usually have to draw it at the same time, or it helps to draw it. The priests are the same way. If they're going to talk about a concept, they want to be drawing something at the same time in the sand. And the drawings that go with their concepts, there are about 30 of those that, if you go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, it's the same image, same shape, associated with the same concepts. So that makes it look as if whenever written language was implemented, that they adopted some of these shapes and meanings wholesale from the pre-existing cosmology. But as you look at those and you start examining words that use those glyphs, it starts to become apparent that the glyphs are more than just phonetic values. The concept that goes with the explanation that goes with the shape has pertinence also. So I had the benefit of looking at a very simple Egyptian word. It was a word for week, like the number of days in a week. And it was written with two Egyptian glyphs. The first was a circle with a dot in the middle of it, which is the sun glyph, and that can represent the concept of a day. And the second one was an upside down U shape that is the number 10 in ancient Egypt. And so I looked at that word, and what the word said to me was 10 days. Symbolically, that's what it said. So I went and I did some research and discovered, sure enough, the ancient Egyptians had a 10-day week. So I realized that I had just learned something that I didn't previously know about ancient Egypt, that they had a 10-day week, just by looking at the form of the word. And so I wondered, could other words also work that same way? And it turns out that, all the ones that pertain to cosmology do.
Well, and people think that using symbols is just such a primitive and foreign thing, but the reality is we use symbols every day. I mean, if we see this big red hexagon shape, we immediately think it's a stop sign. You know, there's
Right.
not any other meaning, or my favorite, the golden arches. You know, all we need to see is the golden arches, and we immediately know McDonald's and maybe start humming, you know, the Big Mac jingle or
Right.
something.
It's a really good way to shortcut a meaning for somebody. I mean, it's like corporations using like CBS instead of, Columbia Broadcast Company. People get used to the abbreviated form, or on the internet typing LOL instead of laugh out loud. That kind of shorthand has value, and the Egyptians realized that.
But I would think also that there was only a very small percentage of the population that read, that were able to read and write, where if it's a picture, you don't have to understand what the symbols are. You don't need to put these symbols together into words, because the intrinsic meaning is taught to you as you're growing up, and it's just part of your life and not something that you necessarily have to learn in school.
Right, and the Dogon, the African tribe, actually don't have a written language, and I've noticed over the years of my study that the cultures that did the best job of keeping all this information straight were the ones that never wrote it down. They never had a written language. It's like there's something about writing it down that absolves you of having to remember it or learn it. So writing was something that potentially anybody could learn to do. I mean, just like the secrets of these traditions, potentially anybody could learn it, but you had to be dedicated to the process of learning it.
Right. In your study of Egyptian hieroglyphs, did you ever notice where there was a transition in the meaning or the way that they utilized the symbols? Because you're talking about, today they say there's a phonetic value, and I see how, you see Zahi Hawass, and he's like, oh, here's this curse, and it said blah, 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 because he's reading the symbols. Or they say the name of a pharaoh, and, Amon Ra, and has a little sun symbol, Ra. And so I get that's the phonetic, but have you found any pharaoh names or anything that falls out of that phonetic convention into more of the symbolic convention? Do you know where it really started to change, I guess?
Well, I think it was always on two levels. And that if you want to know the real meaning of an Egyptian word, you substitute symbols for glyphs, and it produces a little sentence like that, the word for week that says 10 days. It tells you its own meaning. The other Egyptian words work the same way. If you want to know what their intended meaning was for a word, you translate, you substitute concepts for symbols, and you produce this little sentence that defines it for you. And then if there's some ambiguity about what they might have meant, usually there's more than one word for the same thing, or you can check against other cultures that had the same concept and try to triangulate in on what it meant. Then there's also another really interesting device in the language. With certain words, there's a trailing glyph at the end of the word that doesn't get pronounced. And the Egyptologists feel that it's there for emphasis. So usually it's a picture of something that has to do with the meaning of the word. But I could see, looking at the words from my way of reading them, that that glyph was there because the word defines the meaning of that glyph. It assigns a meaning to that glyph. And so now once I realized that, then, I could develop a long list of Egyptian glyphs and what they mean based on what the Egyptians said, not based on what I think or what the Dogons say or what the Buddhists say or whatever.
Can you give me an example of that, of something that you found that had that trailing glyph on it?
There are lots of examples in books that I've written. Coming up with one off the top of my head is sort of hard, but that's okay. For example, there are Egyptian words for the concept of a day where the trailing glyph is that sun glyph. And so if you didn't already realize that the sun glyph meant that, it referred to that, you could tell from this word that it does. But there are also other meanings that might assign to the same glyph. Part of the problem in Egypt is, or with this ancient creation tradition is, they're talking about three different themes of creation. They're talking about how matter forms, how the universe formed, and how biological reproduction happens. But sort of to show off how capable they were, I think, they define these three themes in parallel with one another using a single progression of glyphs. So, for example, the image of a hemisphere, if we're talking about biological creation, it represents a womb, a woman's womb, an expanded womb. If we're talking about matter, it represents the concept of the expansion of mass as atoms form. So,
well, if you're a pregnant woman, that's pretty equal to me.
That's right. And so it's not really a fair question to ask, what does this symbol mean? You really have to ask, what does this mean in relation to the formation of the universe, or what does it mean in relation to biological reproduction? And the meanings are comparable, but they aren't always identical.
So it sounds almost like they talk about the quilt cupas, the knotted cords in South America the Inca had, and yes. They had ones that were for government and ones that were for accounting and if the accounting one ended up in the Hall of Records, they had no idea what it said because it was totally out of context to what their governing was.
And that's not really true with Egyptian hieroglyphs. I mean, the Egyptians had this system of writing for almost 3,000 years, and the conventional wisdom is that a priest practicing at 700 BC would have been perfectly capable of reading a text written by a priest at 3000 BC.
I'm going back to that trailing symbol thing, which I think is really interesting, but what it made me think of was like a math equation. 2 plus 2 equals 4, and so if the glyph is 2 plus 2, whatever those symbols would be, 2 plus 2, right. And then they put a 4 at the end as this trailing symbol. I don't know how they identify that. I mean, it kind of makes me think that like almost it's a dictionary.
Yeah, it actually is. That turns a dictionary actually into an encyclopedia for me because of the way the words work. But, I mean, if you think again of modern logos like CBS, they have the letter CBS, but then they have that I symbol that represents CBS. And so you associate the abbreviated name with the picture. A lot like your McDonald's logo also. You see the word McDonald's, but then you see the golden arches.
Mm-hmm. But I think that that's interesting. Okay, so, all right, I'm not putting you on the spot, but I have to ask. So in your digging around and, playing around with these translations, there's the conventional meaning, and then there's the implied meaning based on the symbols. Have you come upon anything that has been surprising?
In the usual case, the reading of the symbols conveys nuances of meaning that are not obvious from the traditional translation. And so, for example, a word for book, you understand that it means book, but the glyphs of it might say that which is read. Or another word for book might say that which tells a story. So there are different perspectives on the potential meaning of a word. And those, in Dogon language, those play out as multiple meanings of the same word because they don't have a written language. But when you get to Egypt, because these words are spelled conceptually, not phonetically, you end up with words that are homonyms of each other, but they're spelled differently. They sound alike, but they're spelled differently, and they represent different aspects of meaning for the same concept. And so, if you want to know now, what did they mean when they said Kem, the Egyptian word Kem, which was an ancient name for Egypt, you can look at the various words that are pronounced Kem and get sort of triangulate in on all the different meanings that play on that. It really is a big help to try to research something.
You're a better man than me. Oh, wait, I'm not a man. Oh, yeah, I'm on air. Sorry. When we talk about other languages like Hebrew or another one that comes to mind as an ancient script like runes, they're also, in my mind, symbolic, although not symbolic in the same way that the hieroglyphs are. But do you see the same kind of thing? I mean, I know that, like in Hebrew or even with the runes, you'll have one, and I'm just kind of making this up, that this symbol means ox, and this symbol, or letter means hook or needle, which I can't even imagine how you could take these concepts and put them together and make something that would make any sense.
Well, there are commonalities back and forth. A lot of the African tribe words, which I relate to the Egyptian words, are also Hebrew words and have the same meaning. They come from the same roots they carry. And somebody did me a big favor in that these multiple meanings of the words make it really easy to correlate from language to language. Because even if the word isn't pronounced the same way in the second language, the same set of meanings go together with that word. And so it came out of the same tradition. But because the words are conceptual, they're written with symbols that are meant to convey concepts, they didn't need vowel sounds. They weren't using these words to pronounce. They were using them to read as concepts. And so one of the hallmarks of a language that works this way is they omit the vowel sounds. And Hebrew does that. So immediately when you see a Hebrew word and understand that they didn't originally write the vowels, it's an easy guess that this was part of the same system. And so you do have correlations that happen there. There's an Egyptian glyph called a reed leaf glyph. It's a picture of a reed, a standing reed. And one of them all by itself represents the concept of coming into being. It represents a geometric point. It's a single point. Two of them together are like the equivalent of two geometric points that define a line. And that represents the concept of existence, two reed leaf glyphs. The correlate in Hebrew to that are two yud characters, which is the symbol that in Judaism they substitute for the name of God. Conceptually, from a cosmological standpoint, it represents the concept of existence. A really good concept to associate with God.
But see, that's really an interesting twist just on that word, where many people think God is this person, but if you get into like very Kabbalistic viewpoint, the concept is we are God, we are the manifestation of this existence. And that is played out by what you're saying, just by that one word using the Hebrew word for it.
Right, and that's sort of a trend between the Dogon and other cultures that had the classic religions. Is everywhere the Egyptians have an image of a deity, like a fish-headed deity or a bird-headed deity or whatever. On the Dogon side, they have a concept of creation, not a god, not a anthropomorphized god. So you can see that these started out as concepts and later were deified. Same thing in India. The earliest versions of the tradition, they weren't trying to make representations of a god in a human form. These were concepts, and there were symbols that related to the concepts. You get down to the basic philosophies, and the tradition rests on two philosophies that are inherently atheistic, although they spawned philosophies that were theistic later. But the idea is that as you get down to the bottom of this, in the original version of it, you don't bump into an actual deity. They come out and actually say, "Look, this isn't about a god."
Do you think that the Dogon were actually the original culture and then Egypt spun off of them? Or do you think Egypt was, or that area, I'll just say that region was the original culture? Egypt moved forward and became more anthropomorphic, and the Dogon just retained the original wisdom themselves?
I think that what happened was there was. Okay, a lot of these traditions describe their religions or their creation traditions as having been instructed. And they've been instructed hand in hand with civilizing skills like agriculture and how to domesticate animals and how to carve stones and how to create metals and things like that. There are civilizing skills that go hand in hand with these concepts of creation. I think that at 10,000 BC, a lot of different cultures were instructed in these same skills, and Egypt was one of those. I think the Sphinx is a remnant of that 10,000 BC instruction, but I think the instruction happened in the region of the Fertile Crescent, up near Turkey and Iran. And I think at 4,000 BC, there was a second round of instruction that happened, and at that point in time, actually around 3,200 BC, and at that time, the Dogon were Egyptians. All of their civic traditions make it look like they were Egyptian at 3200 BC. And that was the group that had kept the concept straight for over that span of thousands of years. They were the ones who kept a hold of it best, understood it best, preserved it, and could explain it the best. And then shortly after dynastic Egypt, or about the time of dynastic Egypt, the Dogon split off from the Egyptians. There was sort of a tradition of sending priestly groups out to relocate themselves deliberately someplace very remote, almost like you would make a backup of your computer and store it someplace safe. That's what these priestly cultures were. And there was one sent up to Tibet and China called the Naki, and the Dogon looked like they were another one. It looks to me like descriptions of, if they're historical, we're not sure they are, of Moses and the Israelites look like another group that was deliberately sent out who had the skills to survive in a remote location, so it wasn't a surprise they were able to survive. The Hopi Indians do the same thing. There are a lot of other groups that do the same thing.
You were mentioning the Fertile Crescent, and as I'm sure everyone that listens to my show knows, there's the ancient site of Gobekli Tepe that
Right.
is littered with images and of animals and different symbols. Have you spent any time looking at that, and have you found any parallels to, let's say, the pictograms in Egypt or the concepts that you found in Egypt in the symbology that is represented on those pillars?
I have looked at it. I had done some initial research about it when John Anthony West and Robert Schoch took a trip to Gobekli Tepe, and I had wanted to prepare for a meeting I had with them before they left. The one purpose of my book, Point of Origin, which is the most recent book that I have out, was to try to tie what we find at Gobekli Tepe in Turkey at 10,000 BC forward to the 3000 BC era traditions, the ancient Egyptian, the ancient traditions in India, the Dogon, other cultures like that. And it's a tricky thing to do, but what we find at Gobekli Tepe is the first set of megalithic standing stones placed in a circle with carved, actually we have multiple circles, with carvings on the stones, fine carvings of images of animals and of certain symbols. And the trick was to find a way to try to tie that positively forward to the later traditions, because it looked like they connect. A lot of the animals that are pictured were adopted as icons of deities and of rulers, like kings and queens in later times, pictures of scorpions, pictures of serpents, pictures of bulls, things like that. The first thing I noticed was the way you get at it is a little tricky because writing doesn't appear until 3000 BC, so we don't have any written text to rely on to be able to help us. At 10,000 BC, the farther back in time you go towards 3000 BC, the more commonality of language you get. So we know that I could demonstrate that at 10,000 BC, the way that they used certain words was similar to the way the Egyptians and the Africans used the words. So in trying to understand these animal images that were on the pillars, I looked at the Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary and realized that the names for all these animals were pronounced like important terms of the cosmology. They were homonyms. And so it was as if a hunter-gatherer could walk up to one of the pillars and see the picture of a goose or a picture of a serpent or whatever on the pillar, speak the name of the animal which he knew, and at the same time be speaking the term of cosmology he was going to be instructed in. And so it was kind of a proto-language where, here, you say serpent, I say concept of cosmology.
Hi, this is Dr. Rita Louise. We hope you've been enjoying the program today. If you'd like to hear more from this guest or other guests we've had on the show, please visit www.justenergyradio.com.